Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at two really significant areas. First, the legal and political heat around immigration policy right now. And second, this proposed big, beautiful bill and what it might mean for the national debt.
Yeah, the sources we have give us a real window into the current landscape, politically and economically.
Definitely. It's complex stuff, but we'll aim to bring some clarity, pull out the key insights for you.
Exactly. Our goal is to sort of look past the headlines, understand what's really going on beneath the surface.
Okay, let's get started then. Part one, immigration. We have to talk about these pretty dramatic events in New Jersey recently.
Right, the arrest of Newark Mayor Ras Baraka, that was May 9th, outside an ICE detention center, Delaney Hall.
And he wasn't alone, was he? He was there with members of Congress.
That's right. Watson Coleman, LaMonica McIver, and Rob Menendez. They were quite open about why they were there.
To inspect the facility, issue some zoning citations, things like that.
And what's interesting, initially, ICE agents actually let them through the gates. They were inside, waiting for further access, when Baraka was apparently asked to leave and wait outside.
Which he did.
Yeah, he went onto the public sidewalk. The members of Congress then joined him out there.
Okay, so they're on the public sidewalk. Then what happens?
Well, this is where things really seem to escalate. Several ICE agents came out, some reportedly masked.
Masked.
Yeah, and according to reports, they started pushing the female representatives before arresting Mayor Baraka right there on the sidewalk.
Wow, that's quite a scene. Pushing members of Congress.
It paints a vivid picture, definitely. Yeah. And then the timeline gets even more, let's say, curious.
Oh, so.
Because after Baraka is arrested on the sidewalk, the members of Congress were then actually given a tour of the facility.
Right. After the arrest and the alleged pushing?
That's the sequence reported, which, makes it hard to square with any idea that they were trying to storm the place or get in improperly.
Right. That detail seems key. So the initial charge was trespassing? What's the deal with that legally in New Jersey?
Well, trespassing is a misdemeanor there. Potential fines, maybe even some jail time. But a key part of proving trespassing is showing the person knew they didn't have permission or shouldn't have reasonably believed they had permission.
And given that ICE let them in at first.
Exactly. That seems like a pretty strong argument that they had a reasonable belief of permission, at least initially.
Which might explain why the charges against Mayor Baraka were dropped pretty quickly Monday night.
It could. One source sort of speculates maybe they got the headlines they wanted and didn't want the hassle of a tricky legal fight.
But it's not over. Because now Representative McIver is facing charges.
Yes, new charges filed against her, assault and obstruction of law enforcement.
Which again seems hard to reconcile with the fact they were then given a tour after the alleged incident.
It does raise questions, doesn't it, about the motivation. Is it straightforward law enforcement or something else, maybe retaliatory?
And the timing with Pam Bondi's proposal. That adds another layer.
Right. Her idea to get rid of the Public Integrity Unit sign-off needed to indict public officials.
If that went through, it would remove a check, potentially make it easier to bring charges like these against officials, maybe for political reasons.
That's the concern some might raise, yeah. Eliminating that layer of independent review before indictment.
And these aren't isolated incidents, apparently. The source mentions other things, like ICE agents allegedly shoving a teenager.
Yes, a 16-year-old girl. If these reports hold up, the agents involved could be looking at serious legal trouble.
Like what?
Excessive force claims, civil rights violations. Plus, there are DHS regulations about agents identifying themselves. The reported masks could be an issue there, too.
So there are limits on ICE authority.
Absolutely. The Library of Congress has a primer on this. Actions like excessive force, failure to identify, they likely fall outside those legal boundaries.
So, bottom line, what's likely to happen next here?
Lawsuits seem very probable. Given the high-profile nature, the charges against McIver, the excessive force allegations, I'd expect substantial damages claims against the officers, maybe the agency itself.
Okay. Let's shift states, but stay in the legal arena. Wisconsin. Judge Hannah Dugan.
Right. She's pleaded not guilty. The charges are obstructing an official proceeding and concealing someone from arrest.
What's the prosecution saying she did?
They claim she helped a defendant avoid being arrested by ICE agents right there at the courthouse, let him and his lawyer slip out a side door near her chambers.
But he was arrested eventually.
Yes, he was picked up outside the courthouse later on.
Did we see a similar case involving a judge during the Trump administration? Charges were eventually dropped, I think.
You're right, there was a case in Massachusetts with some parallels, and those charges were indeed dropped.
Okay, but here's the really interesting part in Judge Dugan's case. Her defense.
Ah, yes. The motion to dismiss based on official acts immunity.
Using the precedent from Trump v. U.S., the very case dealing with presidential immunity.
Exactly. Her lawyers are arguing her actions fell within her judicial duties, her official acts, and so she should be immune from prosecution under that standard.
The potential irony there is pretty thick, isn't it? Using a Trump-related immunity argument in a case like this.
It's certainly a notable legal strategy. We'll have to see how the court responds.
Okay, one more perspective on immigration before we move on. Conservative lawyer John Yoo.
Yes, known for authoring the so-called torture memo during the Bush administration.
And he's raising concerns about the current administration's immigration policies.
He is, quite strongly actually. He's quoted as saying they've gone too far.
Specifically regarding what?
Primarily their use of the Alien Enemies Act. Yoo argues Congress hasn't ratified its use in this way, and crucially, he says there's no recognized act of war to justify invoking it now.
He connects that to the Trinidad gang.
Yes, he points to that declassified memo saying the gang isn't actually an arm of the Venezuelan government, which undermines the whole invasion rationale for using the AEA against Venezuelans or others associated with the gang.
And he contrasts the current situation with post-9/11 detentions.
Right. He makes the point that even back then, people detained within the U.S. under the Alien Enemies Act still received due process. He suggests that's not happening now.
So a difference in treatment for those detained inside the U.S. versus, say, captured abroad.
Precisely. He emphasizes that distinction. And his strongest statement, perhaps, is that any attempt to suspend habeas corpus?
Yes.
He says that would absolutely be grounds for impeachment. Coming from him, that's quite significant.
Definitely a viewpoint worth noting from that side of the legal spectrum. Okay, let's pivot now. We need to talk about the economy, specifically the national debt and this big, beautiful bill.
Right. First, some context is probably helpful. The U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio.
Where does that stand now?
As of May 2025, it's sitting at 122%, which is high.
How high compared to history?
We're talking levels not seen consistently since the aftermath of World War II. It peaked at 106% in 1946.
So we brought that down significantly after the war, right?
We did. Got it down to about 32% by the mid-70s. That was driven by strong economic growth, some fiscal discipline, even with Cold War spending.
But the situation now is different.
Well, yeah. The post-war U.S. had huge manufacturing advantages, rapid population growth, factors that aren't quite the same today. Relying just on growth to shrink the debt might be harder now.
And we've seen the debt ratio climb more recently.
Oh, yeah. The Reagan era saw increases, then the 2008 financial crisis pushed it up, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic response sent it spiking to the highest level ever in U.S. history.
So against that backdrop, enter the big, beautiful bill proposed by President Trump, price tag around $3.34 trillion. What's actually in it?
Okay, the biggest piece is making the 2017 Trump tax cuts permanent. That alone is estimated at about $4.5 trillion over 10 years added to the debt.
Wow, okay. What else?
It also proposes eliminating income tax on tips and overtime pay. And there's funding for border security, about $20 billion for ICE and wall construction.
Are there any proposed offsets? Ways to pay for this?
The bill suggests some cuts to Medicaid and rolling back certain green energy subsidies.
Okay, so the administration is likely saying this pays for itself or even saves money.
That seems to be the claim, yeah. Projecting $1.6 trillion in savings. But
independent analyses disagree.
Starkly. The Penn-Wharton budget model, for instance, projects it would add about $3.3 trillion to deficits over the decade, not save money.
That's a huge difference. Almost $5 trillion swing between those projections.
It is. And that analysis also points to increased interest costs on the debt because of the extra borrowing, maybe another $1.4 trillion by 2032.
So politically, where does this stand? What are the odds it actually passes?
Well, it squeaked through the House Budget Committee, very narrow vote, 17-16.
Only after concessions.
Right, concessions on Medicaid work requirements to bring some fiscal conservatives on board. But big fights remain.
Like what?
Disputes over the SALT deduction state and local taxes, and more arguments over Medicaid reforms. So passage odds are seen as moderate, but definitely fragile.
Speaker Johnson wants a vote soon.
Aiming for before Memorial Day in the House. But the Republican majority is razor thin, like 220, 213. They can only afford maybe 3 defections.
And the Freedom Caucus.
They're pushing for even deeper spending cuts, which complicates things further.
And even if it passes the House, the Senate is another hurdle.
Absolutely. Potential for Republican amendments there, which could delay it, water it down, maybe even kill it.
And public opinion.
That's a factor, too. You're hearing criticism already about the tax cuts favoring the wealthy, and the potential impact of Medicaid cuts could worry moderate voters.
So we mentioned that high debt ratios historically tend to happen during emergencies, like wars, and are followed by austerity or growth.
Mm.
How does this bill fit that pattern?
It really tests it, doesn't it? Proposing big deficit-funded tax cuts plus controversial spending cuts when we're not in a declared national emergency like WWII and the debt is already very high. That's unusual territory.
Its fate really hangs on GOP unity in Congress, then.
Pretty much. In such a narrowly divided Congress, they need almost everyone on board.
Okay, let's bring this down to a really concrete example. Tariffs. We got some numbers from a listener, MM, in Bloomington, Illinois, about Walmart.
Yeah, this really puts a spotlight on the potential real-world impact of these broader trade policies.
Walk us through the numbers MM shared.
Okay, so Walmart's annual cost of goods sold, code GS, is huge, $463 billion.
And a lot of that comes from China.
Estimates about 60%. So maybe $278 billion worth of goods imported from China each year.
Now, apply a potential 30% tariff, as has been discussed.
A 30% tariff on $278 billion. That's an extra $83 billion, roughly, an added cost for Walmart.
$83 billion. How does that compare to their profit?
Well, Walmart's net income in 2024 was about $16.3 billion.
Yeah.
So if Walmart had to absorb that entire $83 billion tariff cost,
They'd be deep in the red.
yeah, looking at a potential loss of around $67 billion based on those numbers. And notes this doesn't even factor in earlier tariff threats.
That's just staggering. For one company.
It is. And remember, Walmart has 4,600 U.S. stores, 1.6 million U.S. employees. They're a massive part of the retail landscape, especially groceries.
So the implication is they probably can't absorb that cost.
It seems unlikely they could absorb all of it, which means those costs, or a large chunk of them, would almost certainly get passed on to consumers.
Higher prices on everyday stuff.
That's the likely outcome. So a policy aimed at, say, boosting domestic industry could end up hitting the wallets of American shoppers,
Yeah.
potentially including the very people who supported the policy hoping for lower costs.
And Walmart's just one example, right? Many retailers rely heavily on imports.
Exactly. This potential Walmart problem could be a much wider economic issue impacting lots of businesses and consumers if such tariffs were broadly applied. It really shows how interconnected things are.
Wow. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground today, a real deep dive.
We certainly have, from courtroom battles and constitutional questions around immigration.
To multi-trillion-dollar budget proposals and the nitty-gritty impact of tariffs on your shopping bill.
It's a lot to process.
It is. So to wrap up, we've seen these legal fights over immigration, raising questions about executive power, due process, the treatment of individuals.
And we've looked at this huge proposed economic shift, the big, beautiful bill, with its potential impacts on the national debt, contrasted with the very tangible effects of trade policy shown by the Walmart example.
Which brings us to a final thought, maybe something for you to chew on.
How do these two seemingly separate things, the legal battles over who belongs and how they're treated, and the big economic plans for taxes and spending, how do they connect?
What broader vision do they reflect about the government's role, about individual rights, about the kind of country we're building?
And looking ahead, what long-term consequences, intended or unintended, might you anticipate seeing from these developments?
It's worth thinking about how these big currents, legal and economic, really intertwine and shape the future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.